The need for interpretation proceeds from unexamined shared premises with spatial science. Desperation that demands two worlds and fails to question starting with a confused where, what amalgam, such as world, universe, and even cosmos, and so on, that won't acknowledge that it is the night sky and neglects the earth. Yeah, to go a little further, the bestness of where among the questions or the question kinds itself remains unquestioned and has to serve as the foundation. Consider the title, for example, of Schopenhauer's magnum opus, The World, as will and representation. Among these questions, these gates into knowledges or sciences that are good for the achievement of goals, among these questions, where remains supreme in Schopenhauer's mind. How is it that the will can even be the thing in itself, the what in itself, whereas, bad conjunction, but whereas the will itself is primarily manifested in motives, as he argues in his foundational work on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, or causation, premises, motives, and so on. Some guiding questions as well for further dialogue on this channel. Why is it that Nietzsche accuses Plato of having erected two worlds, a world of appearances and a real world? Well, real in this case means behind the foreground, the background behind the foreground. For example, taking too seriously the story of the cave in the Republic in the midst of a conversation on justice. On a side note, give an example of a guiding question. Jim Holt asks, why does the universe exist? In so asking, he has failed to ask whether the universe exists and what meaneth exists. Dark guiding question. It's a mostly smothered lantern. Right does Nietzsche accuse Plato of this architecture of worldness, or this duality of worlds, if for the ancients, exemplified by Aristotle, the question of what remains supreme? Was Plato an exception to all the ancients, in that he seemed to fall into beginning with a confused amalgam of where and what? If world is the first thing and not the species on the earth, in the sea, and in the sky, and the stars in the sky, which themselves are things, sky, earth, and sea, then nonetheless made this confused where what, this confused where what thing, but not a thing. It's questionable to grant thinghood to anything that can't be distinguished from others. Reality. If reality means all the things that you ought to admit, not only which ones, what do I have to own up to? What do I owe? What do I owe to? What do I owe credence? We're already moving within, to use a spatial metaphor, some I don't know, culture, or we're already starting with some debt. We're failing to owe why we owe 5,000 euros, for example. We're not asking to whom or why, but color the discussion of this owing within the science that I call proto-economics, the examination of guilt, but also guilts in the plural. Anyway, we'd have some better idea of this this activity or obligation, this unnamed obligation that you ought to admit, and that this admittance is also spatial. It has to do with conceding value from yourself as though you were something in your head to things outside you, so-called objects. Already in this process or pattern of the draining of value from complete things, whether snails and shells or tortoises and their shells, draining of goodness from these into, again, the uniform countable qualities that seem to remain after death. Such a thing, if it is anything, reality, made not from this camel, this hand, not from this egg, these glasses, my body. It's made from a mere adjective. It's not made from the meat itself, but from the smoke thereof. It's not the apple, but the redness thereof. But what is the realness of anything? Its uniform quantitative attributes that let it be compared with any other thing, but also dissolved into the fundamental building blocks of all things, the currencies. Food, for example. You read a label, you see that it has, say, 100 calories per serving and a certain number of grams of fat, carbs, and proteins, and then insignificant milligrams of everything else. And yet it's grown in the soil in a region by a family with a history of cultivation of vineyards. You hear the phrase, my body. Who is it that says my body, as though he could be somewhere else or as some other manifestation? It's a pattern of speech, speech that perdures in speaking from the point of view of the immortal soul. The body is something that you have or are in, rather than what you are, then from whose point of view? I don't want to say perspective because that's a point in space. I want to offer the thesis that the body is not only what thing, but also what action in birth, death, acts of heroism, and so on, bleeding, breathing, and the like. It's an instance of what act, not just what thing. But the body thus is not, merely the body in space, merely some accidental convergence of currencies, because that's, again, already accepted the priority of awareness and of what materially, but not formally. Name itself as such, even if the scientist, the spatial scientist, won't say what particular space he has in mind. To drain this queue of things owing to be said, if you were to translate reality into English, you would get what? From res, you would get thing, and real, maybe thingly, and so yeah, reality, that's a abstract noun made from an adjective, so maybe you would get thingliness, I had been using the term thinghood. I had coined that to determine whether the concepts that we use in speech qualify for thinghood. But now that I think about it, that seems to be too strict and demand that things be perceptible, whether stars, clouds, animals, and so on. But what else is there besides those? But I think it's a question of priority among the question types. For what thing, if what were the priority, and among the possible variants of what thing were to be first? That is, you have to sacrifice them. You have to pay tithes or 90% taxes. To what? Yeah, if it were just what thing, then we would repeat the entirety of ancient civilization and its limitations, notwithstanding its linguistic superiority to the moderns or the Cartesians. But anyway, I would suggest asking what act and why as the foremost questions that demand our attention, or we just want to. And does the term thingliness, our translation of reality or realitas, does thingliness carry the same clout as reality? And if it doesn't, then why not? What magic does the term reality perform over us? What effect does it have that thingliness doesn't have, even though it's equivalent? Why not? It seems that we have two choices. We can start with space, time, absolute space, absolute time, and the currencies. For example, in the case of food, calories, and then the trinity of fat, carbohydrates, and protein. But in the case of the science of the prediction of uniform motion in absolute space, commonly called physics, people commonly speak of mass, energy, force, momentum, and so on. Outset or point of departure assumes that the main goal is the prediction of this kind of motion, this kind of change, which is an extreme truncation of the possibilities of changes that are in some action. We want to bother saying that the ancients had no physics in the style of Newton and Descartes because change for them was either metamorphosis or even loss of form, potentially something bad. I don't know what other seems to be asking who has created the world, but I think speaking of world without qualification, co-values or shares an unspoken premise or an unspoken love with science. It's part of its conscience or very foundation. Taxonomy of the genera or the species in the plural that are to be found by investigation or reasoning, and analogously the shapes in geometry. Geometry is about distinct different shapes. Triangles differ from circles. Triangles are like so, squares are like so, different formulae for calculating the angles and congruent sides, and likewise, whereas modern calculus, or really the Cartesian or Newtonian system of mathematics, is predicated on a universal infinite space. You might see it on graph paper, for example. If you draw a line y equals x, for example. Mathematic reduces something like a circle to what? X squared plus y squared equals r squared, whatever the radius of the circle is. It's dissolved. It's dissolved into an infinite space, and but it's really dissolved, subsumed, and repaired. It's brought back, so the modern mathematic is able to leverage or reuse the wisdom of the ancients. We're asking then, we have a choice to prioritize where and when, or really where, I think, for the most part. A where, by the way, that has absorbed and eaten up whence and whither. So we no longer think in a three wise way when we think of travel, motion, some kind of progress from whence, through where, and towards whither. But all these actions are merely happening in the same all-encompassing where, just called space. Well, which one? But you can't ask that question because you ought to know already, and you're conscious that this space can't even be called this. It's just space or absolute space. The demonstrative doesn't apply because it's not here. It's not like this jar, for example. So a special science of the articles or demonstratives is absolutely needful to extricate ourselves from the limitations of modern reasoning, I guess. So topple the egalitarian premises in our politics. And who's our? And continuing purely deductively. So we have this choice at the outset to accept the already jurisdiction judicated, I'm losing the verb, but the already having been decided loves or preferences for the question types where and when, exemplified in absolute space and time, and a really not what, but of what, or from what, Aristotle's material cause, the wooden being more fundamental than the table, for example, or the thing more complete, or in the case of humanity, water being more fundamental than mankind, because you could imagine in this history carried out in space and time that mankind came to be by some accidental convergence of currencies. Now, if you accept that as truth because you fail to ask, well, true to what? True to the prediction of motion, a goal, a desire. So if you accept any unconditional truth like that, having forgotten the goal, but then say, well, it's the intelligent design of a creator, the wooden being more fundamental than the tree. Asking, anyway, we have this choice at the outset to prefer where and when, or to simulate, to re-simulate the ancients and ask what, and in conjunction therewith to also ask who. Now, are we seriously monotheistic, or do we simulate a kind of monotheism to revivify reasoning, but free from the clutches of the implicit monocosmic, monospatial shackles of, I guess, Cartesian or really post-Cartesian thought, even vulgar post-Cartesian thought, which transfers the reverence that was once due to God, the gods having become a monadic concept, one member or a best member who sheds the particular name, is no longer called Elohim as he was in Genesis, or El Shaddai. The individuality is lost in his seeming triumph, however, to say nothing, however, of the incarnation of Christ in Christianity. Think ancient criticism is enough to topple modernity, but it's not enough to build the future. What is it? and we act against these common fetishes: reality, universe, space, time. Even with respect to food, the calories, for example, if calories are only said of fish, meat, fruit, vegetables, and so on, and even then, I'm really just naming the categories. I'm not speaking of a particular grape. Perhaps it's a kind of non-Catholic Protestant wisdom that secretly doubted the incarnation and transubstantiation and the resurrection, that would just purely prefer to think abstractly as of God the Father, as some of the deistic mathematicians did. And anyways, space or place or Rome, I mean, let's translate them into Latin or Germanic other terms. Place, well, which one? This house, this store, downtown, for example, the mall, the field. Which place? Oh, because you most know. It's not that you know, but you skio, not, I don't say skio, I would say conskio, to activate this concept of conscience, or what Freud had called the superego. From Latin into Germanic is like a counterspell against the magic that works us. And anyway, this pattern of naming but no longer naming that had taken place, for example, in the transition from Elohim to God, or just Deus, Gott in German. This transition, I think, because it also occurred with space and time. For example, you no longer say in the reign of King David or the presidency of Donald Trump. Ways of relating things. This is 5 meters or 5 miles from that encampment. This fort is 10 miles thither on the mountain or on the hill. It's a way of comparing two definite things. But it so happened that Descartes, let's just give an individual credit, or Newton, made the decision to, I guess, reify the means of relation into a kind of absolute and to be preferred thing. I call it a thing, but you could call it reality, and that any measurable, whether it's in a kind of uniform time or space, and I'm not allowed to say a in that case, not the, it's absolute, or the article or demonstrative falls at a default because it must be worshipped. Relations, distance, time are a way of speaking about two or more things, whatnesses, comparing them. It's not supposed to be a way of just speaking of one more primary thing, not really what, but a universal where. Not supposed to be a way of speaking of one more primary thing that unthings everything else. And because we're speaking of the shift or major transfer of value from individual things to one dubious thing under this re-ancient criticism, this is where we might speak of nihilism, but also the needful science of proto-economics to study the reallocation and deallocation of value from species to monads. Only 2 options: to go along with the spatially fundamentalist science outset, to prefer where, let's just say where, or the ancient preference in taxonomy, geometry, what, and whatnesses or different species can be distinguished laterally or horizontally. Ants differ from bumblebees, and how so? Crickets differ from walruses, and so on. Tigers differ from lion, but the lion is the king of the beasts. So the beasts are also to be arranged in a kind of hierarchy, and animals, in turn, cattle, for example, eat grass and eat the plant life, and the plant life in turn is nourished in the soil, in the earth. But the stars in the sky are composed of a kind of quintessence, an element not to be found on the earth. Who's right? Well, I think it depends. It depends on the goal. If the goal is a prediction of motion and building machines, these are little replicas of the cosmos in the cosmos. This is a fundamental modern brilliance. By all means, the ancients did not have this. They had slingers, ballistas, archery, and the like, but they didn't have this concept of a uniform machine as originally found in a factory, and having become the modern universal computer based on the Turing machine. The ancients were more brilliant in civic life and in the arts, and also in language. The modern mind cannot with ease ever again speak Latin or ancient Greek. Maybe it can. But if it can't do this with ease, what is the problem or the limitation of the modern mind? This difficulty or stumbling block in the reanimation of the ancient languages towards this concept of fluency. I don't want to overvalue fluency because it shortens all vowels or syllables to make speech flow too much and might be unmasculine, and de-emphasize the breathing, the vowels, and so on, the robustness required to actually speak these ancient languages. Anyway, if it's difficult for us moderns, to truly speak Latin, then does this show us something? In the sense of does it offer us a diagnosis of an inherent flaw? In other words, regardless of whether you want to speak Latin for whatever purposes, I don't know, medicine, but I don't consider medicine a noble goal anymore. The body, we should let the body on its own strengthen the immune system through fasting. That's another discussion. But why is it that it's difficult for the modern mind to learn Latin, to think in a modern way, though? In other words, is it the difficulty of the object, or some limitation on the subject? It's the excessive love of space manifested in word order, but also in material homogeny. Material as not wood or tree, but the wood in itself is a different kind of materialism than that of the artist, the sculptor, for instance. So this is the endemic problem, not just the modern languages, but I think the modern mind that reinvented these modern languages. I mean, from the quarry of residue left behind and abandoned, this abandoned inheritance from the ancient. And it's obvious that to truly master Latin, you'd have to overcome a love of where and homogeny. You have to love the manyness, not just in the multiplicity of vocabulary required to have any comfort in an inflected language, but also a love of the manyness that relives polytheism. And Latin remain unparalleled monuments. The modern languages, dependent as they are on word order, having shed the declensions, fallen into a necessity of prepositions, something that I might have said, but nonetheless, the modern languages depend on a very rigid order of the words or the parts of speech in a sentence to deliver meaning, to say nothing of this dubious concept of meaning and interpretation, but that's something else to talk about. But the ancient languages have much greater flexibility in the ordering of not only the words but the parts of speech, the phrases, and so on. So word order is more free to convey emphasis, much more so than it is in any of the modern languages. But who cares? The point is that if you picture the sentence as a set of slots, I don't know if you can see this, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can lay out my parts of speech, or just 3. Where's my subject? Nope. Subject, verb, object. Or 3 different things. So I hit the ball. I have 3 pens, and so on. I can't say 3 pens have I. I mean, you could in poetry, but it's not so easy in English. But of course, in Latin, you had the inflection. So what each part is indicated by its mark, the distinction, I guess. Its badge. It's what it is. And I don't fully understand this concept of phenomenon, but I try to indicate it. That, for example, you would know that an elephant is what it is. How would you know? Well, I see it. It's an elephant, but it has parts. It has tusks. And it has a trunk, and so on. Its size, and so on. Or a camel, you would perceive this thing to be a camel by its humps, for instance. So distinguishing mark, the ability to distinguish from others. For example, the accusative. What do I have here? Anyway, the animus has faded, and thus so has this film. Because speaking is important for remembering at all, what shall the title be? The hierarchy of questions.